Today we have presentations from 5 museum guides. I want to spend just a moment to give you a little background on the collection at the Emily Dickinson Museum. You probably understand or realize or have seen a lot of these objects in the Homestead and the Evergreens, and that they actually come from the 2 houses originally. The Dickinson family sold the Evergreens in 1916 to another family, and at that time, Emily's niece Martha sold some objects, gave away others, and moved the remainder from the Homestead over to the Evergreens. So a number of objects at the Evergreens really originate from the Homestead. The collection also includes the accumulated possessions of the Dickinson family through Martha's lifetime. She died in 1943, as well as objects owned by Alfred and Mary Hampson, who were Martha's heirs. So if we fast forward to 1950, at that time, Alfred Hampson and Mary Hampson made an arrangement to give or to transfer a number of objects to Harvard University at the Houghton. And that included about 600 books from the combined libraries of the Homestead and the Evergreens, as well as several dozen objects, most closely associated with Emily Dickinson herself. Another transfer took place at Mary Hampson's death in 1988, where the books and manuscripts, the most important thing of all, the poem manuscripts from the Evergreens went to Harvard. There was another transfer in 1988, 1990, after Mary Hampson's death, where she bequeathed the remaining documents and books from the Evergreens to Brown University. And there they are held by Brown. So the remainder of the personal objects and furnishings, household accoutrements, artworks, toys, clothing and textiles, that remains in the Emily Dickinson Museum's collection. Just about a year ago, we submitted a proposal to the Institute for Museum and Library Services to allow the Emily Dickinson Museum to catalog this full collection for the first time that the entire grouping is going to be cataloged, and that work has just begun with a new collections manager at the Emily Dickinson Museum, Megan Ramsey. So we're very excited that this is underway. It'll probably be about a 3-year project. And at that time, we'll be able to bring out more and more objects from our collection to use more expansively, more usefully for education and interpretation, and for research. So we'll probably see some of that work coming along over the next few years, and look forward to having a full catalog in about 3 years' time. So today, 5 of our guides at the Emily Dickinson Museum have selected objects and themes that they would like to bring to your attention from this collection. And they are as excited as I am that in the future we will have more objects to work with. So let me introduce our guides right now, and they'll be with us at the end of the presentations to answer questions. So in this order, we'll see presentations by Becky Lockwood about Emily Dickinson's white dress. Melba Jensen considers the fire within Emily Dickinson's stove. Greg Mattingly is going to pull some music out of the Canterbury next to the piano. And Polly Peterson takes a look with us at Emily Norcross's watercolor, The Fishing Party. Melissa Cybulski discusses Dickinson's visit to Mount Vernon. So without further ado, I will move into the presentations.
Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to be here with you to share what I've discovered about Dickinson's white dress and her world. When Dickinson was 34, she wrote, "I tie my hat, I crease my shawl. Life's little duties do precisely as the very least were infinite to me." Emily Dickinson's white dress hints that if we look at it long enough, we can imagine what it was like. In addition to how we imagine her, by examining the creation and care of the dress, we can see the connections to Dickinson's family, town, country, and the world in her life and poetry. The white dress is the only surviving dress that belonged to Dickinson. It is made of cotton fabric with mother-of-pearl buttons and lace trim. The dress was machine stitched with supplemental hand stitching. The original dress, the one on the right, belongs to the Amherst Historical Society. The dress on the left is the reproduction of the dress and is kept in the Emily Dickinson Museum. Many scholars have written about the possible reasons Dickinson chose to wear white. As with many things Dickinson, we really don't know. What we do know is that the dress is comfortable and practical, with the color white being most easily bleached and cleaned, and it is a common house dress of the time, worn when Dickinson was in her late 40s and early 50s. When Dickinson was younger and more active socially, she wore stylish clothing, as she wrote to her cousin when she was about 30. "My sphere is doubtless calicoes. Nevertheless, I thought it neat to sport a little wool. Won't you tell the public that at present a brown dress with a cape, if possible browner, and carry a parasol of the same?" Dressmaking when Dickinson was in her 20s occupied much of her time. Much of the material was purchased as a result of the labor undertaken in Massachusetts factories, where workers wove fabric on mechanized looms. Locally, the economic network for Dickinson included the cotton mill purchased by her family in 1809, the Amherst hat factories that employed hundreds of workers, the half dozen or more dressmakers who visited the family for intensive periods of wardrobe making, and the labor-intensive stitchery undertaken by the Dickinson women. Dickinson was an upper-class wearer and a lower-class maker of clothing. Millicent Todd Bingham described the labor. "Although seamstresses came for a day to cut and fashion the dresses, actual needlework was done for the most part by members of the family. Sewing a fine seam by hand was an endless business. When it is recalled that dresses were lined and built upon by whalebones, thin strips of stiffening, each one of which must be covered before being sewed into the lining, it is not surprising that once achieved, a dress was worn for years." When Dickinson was 22, she wrote to her brother Austin, "I should have written you sooner, but we have had Miss Bangs, the seamstress, cutting dresses for us this week, and have been very busy, so I couldn't possibly write." This 1858 ad in the Springfield Daily Republican, a daily paper that the Dickinsons read, is typical of many ads placed by people needing to hire a seamstress. Seamstresses were low in the class of paid workers. Many stories in the Springfield Republican of the time portrayed seamstresses or sometimes starving women, and sometimes resorting to prostitution to feed their families. This is a photo of a dress form in a room in the Evergreens on which dresses were made. In her early 30s, Dickinson wrote these lines in a poem: "Don't put up my thread and needle. I'll begin to sew when the birds begin to whistle. Better stitches sew." In the Dickinson household, the family hired a seamstress to work in their home for several days, making or revising patterns, adjusting the fitting, and beginning the early stages of the needlework. Emily, Vinnie, and their mother all participated in sewing the clothing, as did Sue next door in the Evergreens. In another letter to her brother, Austin, when she was 2, Dickinson wrote, "She, Sue, is going after Miss Bartlett, a seamstress, tomorrow morning at 5, and begins her dressmaking tomorrow. She says she shall just get through by the time you get home. So shall Vinny, and there must be no sewing then." Caring for the clothing involved a laborious process occurring over several days. Servants did much of the laundry, with Emily, Vinny, and their mother helping. Water was pumped into a copper kettle and heated with separate washes for different fabrics, then rinsed, bluing, and starched cycles. The wash had to be shaken out, wrung out, and hung on a line to dry. A second day was devoted to ironing and a third to mending. This chore was so taxing that many domestic maids refused to do laundry. The Dickinson family hired workers to assist with the laundry, other household chores, and outside work. Over the years, at least 15 Irish workers were hired. This photograph is of Margaret Mayer on the left, who worked as a maid for the family for over 30 years. Tom Kelly in the center worked at the Homestead, and his daughter, Margaret Kelly, on the right, worked for Austin and Susan Dickinson. Class differences between who wears what type of garment and who makes it and cares for it were clear in Dickinson's Amherst. Her relationship to workers at the Homestead were often close and show how the worlds of all were interconnected in her life. Dickinson was buried in a white dress and a white casket. 3 years before she died, she wrote these lines to a friend. "We wear our sober dresses when we die, but summer filled us for a holiday," adjourns her sigh. Thank you all for joining me on this brief examination of Emily Dickinson's white dress.
Welcome to Fire Within. In this scene from the TV series Dickinson, the designers created 2 focal points. On the left edge of the frame, the desk lamp makes actress Haley Steinfeld's face shine, as if the light radiated from her forehead. On the right, white-hot coals glow in the fireplace. There is something organic here. The fire, the moonlight, even the kerosene seem like nature's witnesses to the poet's work. "Shall I take thee," the poet said, "to the propounded word?" If the designers had wished, they could have shown Emily Dickinson's cast iron bedroom stove. In my rendering, the stove sits on the hearth. The moonlight picks out the grape leaf design on its front. But this scene is no longer about witnessing. It is about the transformation of thought into poetry. Dare you see a soul at the white heat. At the Emily Dickinson Museum, Dickinson's bedroom is where the narratives of her life, poetry, and culture intersect vividly. My focal point in the bedroom tends to be her desk and her vocation. However, this focus may slight the extraordinary ferment of the poet's imagination. Combustion became Dickinson's image for the ecstatic insights that she achieved by writing poetry. If we are to take her at her words, we need to talk about her stove. In the next few minutes, I'll describe Emily Dickinson's bedroom stove, the evolution of the hearth image in her poetry, and the 19th century cultural debates concerning the fireplace. In her 1853 letters to her brother Austin, Emily imagined kindling the morning fire, sitting on the stone hearth as it warmed, and talking with her like-minded brother. The letters fuse emotional warmth, physical security, and intellectual stimulation with the image of a fire at the hearth. But the kitchen stone hearth stood in this house on Pleasant Street. The picture shows two chimneys, but when Emily and Austin lived here, the house had a single center chimney. The center chimney was an expansive metaphor. Herman Melville explored its range in his short story, I and My Chimney. Two gray-headed old smokers, he announced in the opening sentence. He called the chimney his Great Pyramid of Cheops because the massive brick pyramid, it measured 10 by 10 feet in the basement and 4 by 4 feet in the attic, determined the arrangement of all the other rooms. Two tiers of hearths oriented all the household activities toward one center. The 10 flues converged in one federal stalk. Melville's metaphorical chimney is his tomb, church, God, king, federation, and his body. Dickinson's hearth metaphor proved equally expansive, but she would direct it inward, toward the felt experience of writing poetry. In 1855, Dickinson moved from the Pleasant Street house to a renovated and spacious homestead that incorporated cast iron stoves into the extant fireplaces in order to heat individual rooms. In Dickinson's bedroom, the stove sits over the hearth, exposing all 6 sides to room air. The more cast iron one could expose, the more quickly the room could be warmed. The basic design of Dickinson's stove was a metal box composed of 6 cast iron plates threaded onto 4 metal rods, cage-capped with a brass finial. For maximum efficiency, the front plate could be equipped with doors. Closing the doors to the firebox ensured that the fuel burnt hotter, cleaner, and more efficiently. In To My Small Hearth His Fire Came, Dickinson's hearth metaphor appears in its mature form. The small hearth is the poet's consciousness, the fire is poetic inspiration, and the poet's body is the house aglow. Dickinson is narrating a deeply private event, but I think the cultural conversations around fireplaces and cast iron stoves in particular made her small hearth metaphor more accessible than 21st century readers might otherwise think. To Nathaniel Hawthorne, a closed stove, the sullen stove, implied nothing less than the collapse of communal sentiments and religious beliefs in a fatal frost of interiority. However, Dickinson's bedroom stove was the product of a growing community, linking Boston with Maine, Rhode Island, and the Connecticut River Valley. Her stove was produced by William A. Wheeler and Company, a foundry in Worcester, Massachusetts, sometime between 1840 and 1850. Wheeler's foundry produced iron plows and box stoves, like the one that ended up in Dickinson's bedroom in Amherst, boiler doors and drive shafts for the machine shops of Boston, water wheel irons and heavy gearing for the textile industries like those developing in Northampton, molds for firearm manufacturers centered around Springfield, parts for locomotives, and finally, the railroad itself. Wheeler supervised the construction of the Worcester and Nashua Railroad, which opened in 1848. Wheeler's foundry was the 19th century's example of a self-replicating machine. Given the proper raw materials, a human operator could reproduce all of the foundry's parts. I believe that Nathaniel Hawthorne's fear of the closed stove was less about the demise of common sociability and more about how powerful this metaphor of self-forging would become. When Emily Dickinson used the language of stoves, hearths, fireplaces, and forges, she used a language that had deep, positive emotional resonances of joy, safety, and intellectual satisfaction. She also tapped into residual notions of Christian purification, the repeated cycles of sin and redemption akin to a refining process. These two readings occupy different and somewhat incompatible emotional registers. I think the cultural conversation around stoves facilitates the reconciliation. Writing poetry allowed Dickinson to refine herself, making her language into an adequate vehicle for her thoughts, ridding her thoughts of unintended meanings. Yes, it required long hours at her writing desk, searching philology for the propounded word. But when the vision came unsummoned in, which I understand to be the moment that old words flash with new resonance, I don't think the cherubim fully described her felt experience. I suspect that at these moments Dickinson felt her language at the white heat, with words forged for her own use. If she were a stove, the cast iron grape leaves would be melting and reforming a new pattern. If Dickinson had been a sinner, she would have had no further need of God. She would have purified herself. Thank you.
There is an object in the Homestead parlor that receives scant notice from visitors, but in it repose treasures that brought bulletins from the world beyond her father's grounds into Emily Dickinson's life. The Canterbury held her sheet music for piano and voice, much of it still extant. Let's explore. Believe me, if all those endearing young charms. This is a popular song from Old Ireland. There were several marches in her collection. This one is The Battle of Prague. And here we have Bayou's Quick Step. Here's another march, Bonaparte's March, crossing the Rhine. There were many waltzes, including 2 collections of these Glen Mary waltzes. Speed the Plow is described here as a favorite dance. Yes, there were minstrel songs. including 2 collections of these old Dan Emmett's original banjo melodies. The picture would not be complete without the Hutchinson family singers. Emily may well have heard them at local fairs, as they were popular throughout the Northeast when she was growing up, eventually achieving national and overseas recognition. Their repertoire included anti-slavery and temperance songs, as they sang at meetings that included Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Frederick Douglass, with whom they were acquainted. Starting out as 3 brothers and soon a sister, as success increased, other family members joined the enterprise. They would have sounded like this.
We have come from the mountains, we have come from the mountains, we have come from the mountains of the old granite state. We're a band of brothers, we're a band of brothers, we're a band of brothers, and we live among the hills.
Hi, I'm Polly Peterson, a guide at the Emily Dickinson Museum, inviting you to join me in taking a closer look at the picture over the mantel in Emily Dickinson's bedchamber. The picture is called Fishing Party. It's a watercolor painting signed by Emily Norcross, Emily Dickinson's mother, and dated 1827. I first noticed it when I visited the museum in 2015, shortly after I moved to Amherst from Concord, Massachusetts. I was a member of the board of directors of the Robbins House, an organization dedicated to Concord's African American history. So I was especially curious to know how this depiction of an enslaved Black man serving a party of white people came to be prominently displayed in the poet's bedroom. I became even more curious a few months later when I saw this watercolor painting by Lydia Hosmer at the Concord Museum. She had depicted the exact same scene and given it the same title. I discussed this coincidence with David Wood, curator of the Concord Museum, and he pointed me to the original painting from which both pictures were derived. This oil painting, called The Angler's Repast, was painted by George Morland, a British artist, in 1789. If we flip the original so that the river is on the left, it's easier to see how Emily Norcross's watercolor resembles it. Here you can clearly see how one picture derives from the other. Each depicts a party of 5 well-dressed men and women preparing to enjoy a picnic. A Black servant in full livery is handing a bottle to one of the men. This mezzotint of Morland's painting was a popular and widely available print. It is likely that a somewhat simplified drawing was made from this mezzotint for young ladies to use as a pattern for needlework or painting. Lydia Hosmer painted hers in 1806 at the age of 17 while attending Mrs. Rowland's Academy in Medford, Massachusetts. 6 years later in Concord, she had it framed and added the date 1812. Whether Emily Norcross likewise first encountered the image while a student at the Monson Academy or at her boarding school in New Haven, Connecticut, we don't know. But according to Harvard's Houghton Library, she also created a needlework piece based on the same drawing. What was the appeal, and what motivated her to complete this work in 1827 as she prepared for her marriage to Edward Dickinson? Was she looking forward to decorating the walls of their home with an image that especially appealed to her sense of who she was or wished to be? Elise Lemire's 2009 book about slavery in Concord and Lincoln, Massachusetts, displays part of Lydia Hosmer's painting on the cover. Slavery was commonplace in New England throughout the colonial period and only gradually died out toward the end of the 18th century. As Lemire explains, the enslaved man in livery depicted here was a symbol of prosperity and prestige. Much as a large, elegant house and a fine horse-drawn carriage served that function for Squire Edward Dickinson. Emily Dickinson's 1864 poem, Color, Caste, Denomination, expresses a belief that souls after death are no longer subject to classification in the way that bodily lives are on earth. Death's large, democratic fingers rub away the brand, she wrote. I find no evidence, though, that Emily Dickinson ever believed the hierarchy of social status that placed her family on a top rung of privilege was wrong or unjust. She poked fun at women who were drawn to charitable work and showed no interest or sympathy in the anti-slavery or women's rights movements, despite her friendship with Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was deeply committed to these reforms. In the case of the third category in the poem, denomination, Dickinson changed her attitude over time. Virulent anti-Catholicism was an element of the Protestant culture of Massachusetts, and the enormous influx of desperately impoverished Irish Catholic immigrants during the 1850s felt very destabilizing and disruptive to established families like the Dickinsons. Emily's letters include a range of disparaging and insensitive remarks about the Irish. However, after years of close proximity to her Irish servants, especially the woman she called Maggie, who joined the household in 1869, Dickinson began to appreciate them, so much so that she defied social convention by requesting that the family's Irish farmhands serve as her pallbearers after death. When it came to color, though, she did not lose her discomfort. As late as 1881, Dickinson wrote her friend Elizabeth Holland, "We have a new black man and are looking for a philanthropist to direct him, because every time he presents himself, I run." The word caste in the poem is much more powerful than the word class would be, since it suggests a permanent and inescapable status. For a time, the Irish occupied the same lowly status as Blacks, but they were allowed the social mobility to rise to higher status jobs, and within a couple of generations, many of them assimilated into the middle class. Meanwhile, Blacks were consigned to the most menial jobs and were commonly denied even the most mundane courtesies of social acceptance. They were expected to accept the immutable nature of their inferior status. For Dickinson, they would always be outsiders. Emily Dickinson was intimately connected to this picture all her life. She knew that her mother had chosen to paint it, frame it, and display it. What values might it have mutely transmitted by its very presence in the poet's home? This object provides a valuable avenue for exploring the poet's ideas about social class and privilege.
Away from Amherst, Emily Dickinson at Mount Vernon, 1855. When you visit the Emily Dickinson Museum in Amherst today, you will notice on a small table in the corner of the front parlor a blue decorated bandbox. Boxes like these were used by women to transport hats or other finery when traveling. It is believed that this bandbox belonged to Emily Dickinson's mother, and it represents a 5-week period in 1855 when Emily traveled with her sister Lavinia as they accompanied their father on a trip to Washington, D.C. Behind the box, you will notice an image of the U.S. Capitol building, and this building had everything to do with the trip. For Edward Dickinson, this trip was for business, but for his daughters, this would be a social and sightseeing opportunity. Edward Dickinson served as a representative in Congress for the 10th District of Massachusetts from 1853 to 1855. Perhaps as a cure for winter doldrums, perhaps because he knew what an extraordinary opportunity this would be for his two daughters, he invited Emily and Lavinia to accompany him on this trip. Emily was 24 years old at the time, and Lavinia would turn 22 during the trip. The gathering of congressmen from around the country filled D.C. newspapers with mentions of arrivals at local hotels, reports on lavish balls held, news of congressional business, and ads for local sightseeing opportunities for tourists. One newspaper mentioned the arrival at Willard's Hotel of an E. Dickinson and daughters, New Hampshire. Perhaps Edward's handwriting was to blame for the incorrect home state, but it is highly likely that this is indeed our E. Dickinson and daughters. What little we know directly from Emily as to how she spent her time in Washington, we know from 2 letters that she wrote during her time away from Amherst. One was to Susan Gilbert, Austin's future bride, and the other to Elizabeth Holland, a friend from Springfield. How did Emily and Lavinia spend their days in the city? Again, hard to say with certainty, but we know for a fact that this book was a part of the family's library and likely informed their sightseeing decisions. We also know for a fact from the letter that Emily wrote to Mrs. Holland that one of the tourist attractions she did visit was Mount Vernon, the home and final resting place of George Washington. These images are from Houghton Library's digital database of the Dickinson Family Library. They have in their collection this book, Morrison's Stranger's Guide to the City of Washington. On the inside cover, we see Edward's inscription dated 1854. What then did it mean to visit Mount Vernon in 1855? Much is written about the solemnity of a visit to Mount Vernon in 19th century America, and many images exist of touring parties traveling there. Spending a day at Mount Vernon was a must-do for many travelers, and they write about it with great reverence, as Emily does in her letter to Mrs. Holland. This advertisement for a steamer to Mount Vernon appeared frequently in D.C. newspapers in February 1855. Trying to capitalize on the intense interest in visiting his great-granduncle's home, John Augustine Washington III had entered into a partnership with the steamship Thomas Collier, allowing it to dock at the base of the estate. It is likely that this is in fact the painted boat Dickinson would have taken down the Potomac River the day of her visit. Besides descriptions Emily may have read, this simple sketch from Morrison's Guide may be the only idea the poet had of what Washington's tomb might have looked like. Perhaps her view of Washington's tomb was like this photographic image taken during the 1850s. It is easy to forget when we see so many sepia-colored photos, however, that Emily Dickinson and her contemporaries lived their lives in full color. Today, in full color, Mount Vernon looks much the same, like this. Visiting in late winter, surely not as green, but awe-inspiring to a traveler from Amherst nonetheless. The burial vault at Mount Vernon today looks nearly identical to how Emily saw it 165 years ago. The same obelisks surrounded by iron fencing, the same brick walls and iron doors protecting the remains of Washington and his wife. Notice the sarcophagus at the center of the photo within the brick vault. Today it is the same, and up close, Emily would have seen it like this. Washington, with Martha at his side, safe in their alabaster chambers, untouched by morning and untouched by noon. These period images helped to picture the visit as Emily may have experienced it. In her letter to Mrs. Holland in March 1855, Emily writes, "If you haven't been to sweet Mount Vernon, then I will tell you how on one soft spring day we glided down the Potomac in a painted boat and jumped upon the shore, how hand in hand we stole along up a tangled pathway till we reached the tomb of General George Washington. How we paused beside it, and no one spoke a word, then hand in hand walked on again, not less wise or sad for that marble story. How we went within the door, raised the latch he lifted when last he went home. Thank the ones in light that he's since passed in through a brighter wicket. Oh, I could spend a long day if it did not weary you telling you of Mount Vernon, and I will sometime if we live and meet again, and God grant we shall." Emily returned home to Amherst, and within months her life forever changed. Her father moved the family out of the Pleasant Street home that had been her comfort for 15 years and back into the Main Street home we associate with her today. 1855's trip was truly Emily's last time out in society in any active way. In the ensuing years, Emily Dickinson would begin her retreat more and more from the world outside her home and begin her life as a poet in earnest. Exactly 1 year after she wrote her letter to Mrs. Holland, this article appeared in the local Hampshire Gazette with another traveler's reminiscences of Mount Vernon. Did it stir sweet memory in Emily as she read the account? It reads, "I turned my back upon the city of the living to spend a day with the departed. We landed in a quiet cove at the foot of the steep hill on which the mansion is situated. We followed a rude footpath up the hill, and then coming out from the woods, stood directly before the tomb of Washington. It is a plain, simple tomb surrounded with a brick wall 12 feet high. Our party had left me, and as I stood alone within a few feet of the illustrious dead, and amid an almost deathly silence, I was carried back into the past. The impression made by that hour of communion with the silent dead cannot easily be forgotten."
So I want to thank Melissa, Polly, Greg, Melba, and Becky for putting these objects into context, which is part of the point of being able to have and interpret objects from the Dickinson homes. And I believe they are with us in case anyone has some questions. Again, you can raise your hand under participants or put your question in the chat. So I perhaps I could ask a question of Melba about the bringing Melville's and Hawthorne's views about fireplaces and fires and sort of the literary cultural context of the hearth. Wonder if you could comment a little on that.
Well, sure.
when I found each of them individually, I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? And then when I reached a section in Andrew Jackson Downing's work, where he vehemently inveighed against closed stoves, I thought, no, this is really a cultural discussion. People were weighing in on the architecture of the time, and stoves and fireplaces in particular, as a way of talking about what the ideal community would be like, and what metaphor you wanted to burn in order to keep you warm. And so that's why I put it in, because I thought that knowing that that was a conversation might indicate why Dickinson had focused on the stove and hearths and flames, and particularly in that poem, Dare You See the Soul at the White Heat, which is just one of my favorites.
Yeah, thank you. It reminds me of this comment by the housekeeper at the Homestead, who talked about stoves giving her bone decrepitudes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Diana Fraser, you have a question. Diana, are you here? And are you unmuted?
Okay. I want to say what a wonderful presentation by everyone. I was thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. Elizabeth Petrino.
Thank you, Jane. And this was just a great example of how material culture can allow us to think differently about Dickinson and her work and life and times. So I really appreciate it. It's also going to be phenomenal on a YouTube channel that Adeline is already probably posting. But I wanted to ask a question to Polly, because I'm also really interested in that painting. And in one sense, it seems like that could just be a typical kind of schoolgirl's exercise that one would do. Dickinson's mother's generation, we know that women frequently did needlework, and they did those sorts of paintings as well. I had no idea, and I think it's really fascinating that that it's based on an English model, because this would have been obviously an American family that was invested in the whole idea of, status and a certain degree of influence, and that the figures are transposed. And I'm just wondering if we know, do we know that this actually always remained in her room? And B, do we have any examples of, and I don't think we do, but I'd like you to tell me, are there any examples of any kind of material work that Dickinson did herself, that is in the way of either painting or needlepoint or anything of that sort?
Right. Thanks for the question. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. As far as how this came to be, what fascinated me is that I assumed it was a schoolgirl drawing, and then found out that she had dated it to the age of 23, right before her marriage. So she was clearly still working on it, or did the whole thing at that time. Houghton says that there is also a needlework piece on the same model. I think the reason there's the reversal is because a pattern was made from the mezzotint that in a method, a tracery method, that reversed it once they used it. And you can see better in Lydia Hosmer's painting, I think, that it really looks like it was more or less designed for needlework. And I've asked the Houghton whether they have Emily Norcross's needlework based on that, and I haven't received a reply because the right person is on vacation right now. But my understanding, Jane, you can help with this, is that Emily Dickinson's sampler, most girls did a sampler in those days, is in the collection, but we don't have it. So we have her cousin's displayed in the parlor, which would be very similar to what Emily did, but not the same.
Yes, that's correct, and it's very similar. The question about sort of applied crafts. Emily did a lot of stitching, mending, stitching, sewing, and I don't know of any specific reference about needlework or embroidery.
Right.
She did little, I think she did little doodle drawings sometimes on her letters.
Right.
Along with collage, always cutting little things out and sticking them on and so on. She had an eye for doing little artsy things, but I don't think it was ever her. I think music and poetry.
Exactly. I just find it interesting because this is an imitative piece, right? This is an example of a piece that is deliberately that repeats the composition of someone previous and is done for the reasons of, again, a kind of typical feminine practice in the material arts or in decorative arts. And Dickinson does something, it seems to me, so different with the caricatures and with her own drawing, so that it seems really interesting that she would keep this in her bedroom, if that was the case, to be confronted by it every day.
Oh, right. And you did ask that. And honestly, of course, we don't know. But since her mother framed it and it did end up in Emily's bedroom, I'm sure it was always in the house somewhere where she could see it, if not in her own room, to answer that part of your question.
Thank you.
So Leslie Morris provides clarification.
I just noticed she's the very one that got my question forwarded to her.
Yeah. So I'd like to call on WCT 20.
Thank you, Jane. It's Barbara Dana here.
Oh, hi, Barbara.
Oh, hi, Jane. I can't seem to get that off and my name on, but anyway,
all right.
This is me. I've been interested in this painting of Emily's mother's for years, and I'm wondering, either Jane or Polly, and I enjoyed this presentation very much. Do we know if her mother did any other painting? I mean, this is like right before she got married. Did she do any painting after she got married? My assumption is that it was even harder in these times for women to do anything creative after they got married. It may be and I just wondered if she ever did any other painting. Do we know?
I don't know. Maybe Leslie knows.
Okay. I'm curious. I always thought of it as I don't think this is true, but my own mind was imagining it as if Emily liked to see that her mother also was creative, which was something that was perhaps a surprise to her in a way. She didn't see her as doing much in art or writing, didn't care for thought. But there was an indication that her mother had a creative energy about her.
Her mother also was a good cook and a good gardener, and those are arts that are ephemeral, but probably were very visible to Emily.
Yes, I'm sure.
Certain arts and skills were expected, young ladies would be expected to acquire those arts and skills.
But not do anything with them.
And may not have had an opportunity to do much with them, just as you say. There's a question from someone whose name is Owner. Is Owner still interested in asking a question?
I believe that's Hiroko.
Oh, okay.
I think so.
Okay, Hiroko. And I don't see her. I'll come back to you, Hiroko, if after this question. So programs the ARC.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm Cynthia Kreutzur. And thank you so much for these wonderful presentations. They were just marvelous. I had a couple of questions. From my visits to the Emily Dickinson Museum, I recall a print of a Queen's Deer Park that is in Emily Dickinson's room. And my question was, with the perhaps pride in the English heritage, was that print also always there, or does anyone have any information about that print?
So the one we have at the Emily Dickinson Museum is a duplicate. I mean, it's not the one that was in Dickinson's bedroom, and that, of course, is at Harvard. And Leslie could speak to that. It was there we know at least at the end of Dickinson's life because of the way Martha describes the room.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And does anyone have any more information about that print?
I do not. It just is that I believe it was Currier and Ives.
Okay.
I don't have any more beyond that. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. And then my other question was with regard to Emily Dickinson's needlework. Was that an alphabet sampler?
Yes.
And then is there a
and as Leslie points out, that sampler has been attributed both to Emily and to her mother. So there's not a lack of clarity there. But
okay, thank you. And is there an online image of the original? That's the one that's attributed either to Emily or her mother?
Yes, it's on the Houghton website.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay. It is now 1 minute before 4, and I think I'm afraid that we'll have to close the session now so we can get on to the next thing. If you would like to leave a question in the chat, we'll save the chat and try to get back to you with an answer.
Okay.
But thank you all very much. We've really enjoyed this. And thanks to Polly, Melba, Melissa, Greg, and Becky. Thank you for all your good work.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.